This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer. And today I'm excited to welcome our guest, Nancy Ortmeyer Kuhn, to the show. Now, Ms. Kuhn is a shareholder at Schulman Rogers, where she specializes in tax controversies and tax planning. She's a sought-after expert witness for a range of topics, including nonprofit governance, charitable conservation easements, and general tax issues. Ms. Kuhn is a published author and holds an LLM from the University of Denver. Ms. Kuhn, thank you so much for joining me here today at the Roundtable.
Well, thank you, Noah, for having me. I'm pleased to join you.
Of course. Let's jump into it. So you have been a legal and tax professional for quite a long time, but how did you first get involved in expert witnessing?
Well, I started at the U.S. Tax Court as a law clerk, and then went to the Internal Revenue Service for 10 years, and then jumped to private practice. So I have experience on both sides, both government and on the taxpayer side. So for that reason, I can view a tax issue either from the government's perspective or the taxpayer's perspective, or both, depending on the situation. And I think for that reason, my background is attractive to individuals that are looking for experts in tax. I also have a lot of nonprofit experience, and so there are a lot of unfortunately, there are a lot of nonprofits that are suing each other these days, and a lot of times it has to do with governance issues. And so that really isn't legal. That's more just my experience being on the boards of nonprofits, representing nonprofits. And so I think that's a bit unique to marry the nonprofit governance experience with the tax experience. So I think I probably got started as an expert just because I had been writing about various topics, and I was contacted because my name was out there connected with some of these topics. But it's been fun. I really enjoy being an expert.
So were you specifically looking to become an expert, or did it just kind of fall in your lap a little bit?
It just kind of fell in my lap a little bit, and I tried it, and I really enjoyed it. So then I started pursuing it more seriously.
That brings me to one of my first questions. This is kind of a general question, but it's something that I like to ask our expert witnesses, in particular those who have been doing this for a while. What do you find meaningful about being an expert? Why is expert witness work important?
Well, this may be a little bit self-serving, but when I was first starting out as a young female tax attorney, I wasn't always taken very seriously. I would be in meetings, I would say something, I would just be sort of disregarded. And then others would say the same thing. And it was like it was the best thing the client or whoever we were talking with had heard. And that's a little bit, that got to me after a while. So all these years later, it's very gratifying to be regarded as an expert in my field of tax and nonprofits, and for attorneys and judges to respect my opinions. But also, I really love the give and take of litigation. I also litigate tax cases and represent taxpayers, nonprofits, including nonprofits. And I enjoy the variety of being involved in litigation as an expert. It's a different perspective, and it's a different skill set. And I really enjoy the variety.
Do you have a preference between the two?
Kind of depends on the case, actually. There are some cases when I'm the expert where I really love to get in there and, be representing the taxpayer. But other cases, I'm glad to be the expert in that, not being involved in the nitty gritty of the case.
Sure, absolutely. And, as somebody who has worked on both sides, what are the main factors that make a great or a positive attorney-expert relationship?
I think communication is important. So there aren't any surprises.
Sure.
And, whether you're representing, when I was representing the government, when I represent taxpayers, nonprofits, just so that everyone is open about deadlines, is open about the goals, is open about the strength of the case as well. I just think communication is key to really every relationship, but especially the expert witness relationship, because I don't want to testify as an expert in a case that is just a loser and I'm just wasting the client's money. because litigation is expensive, and if they don't have a case, I I I find it very necessary for me to communicate that to the client. On the other hand, if it's a strong case and they want to settle for something that's really not fair to the client, then that also needs to be communicated. And on the other side of that, I really expect my clients to let me know what's going on in the case on a regular basis, deadlines, so I get my calendar blocked off, and all of those sorts of just administrative details. It doesn't always happen, to be honest, but it's just important to have open communication.
To facilitate that sort of open communication, do experts need to take a particularly proactive approach in making sure that they get their questions answered and that they're in the right place when it comes to an engagement?
Proactive, but not a pest, because litigators are extremely stressed, and they have all these motions to file and pleadings to file and discovery and all of that. So as an expert, I try to give the litigator space, and I obviously need to know what's going on, but I try not to be a pest. So that I
Sure.
just let them do their job, and usually it's not a problem.
You had mentioned settlements. With so many cases going to settlement, how does that affect the role of the expert? In other words, do experts need to prepare as though their case is going to trial every time, or does it somehow affect the calculus of the expectations of the attorney, or the preparation, or any other factors that relate to settlements?
Well, since cases are going to settlement so much, partly because litigation is just so time consuming, it takes forever, um, and it's very expensive. It's important, I think, for the expert to get involved as early as possible so that the expert can shape the guidance and shape the arguments for the attorneys regarding, as I said, the value of the case and the best possible terms for settlement. It doesn't always happen, but at the same time, you're right, the expert has to be ready in case the case does go to trial. Um, and the expert I've been deposed many times, and the case then settles shortly thereafter. But being ready for a deposition is really just the same as being ready for trial. So right, you have to be ready for a deposition or a trial, but at the same time, you have to be realistic about the value of the case and whether it is likely to go to trial. So really, it's more advisory in nature at the beginning rather than purely a litigation role.
Absolutely. With that sort of change, similar to a lot of cases moving on to settlement, have there been any other changes, either in your field specifically or in expert witnessing generally, that has changed the way that you approach expert witnessing?
Not really the way I approach it. Unfortunately, I learned the hard way that I need to get a fairly sizable retainer fee up front.
Oh,
Being an expert witness is time intensive, and there are typically reams of documents that I need to review, including endless deposition transcripts of the fact witnesses. And it just takes a lot of time. And I've trusted clients in the past to pay me after the work is done, and that doesn't always happen. And then it's a problem. So litigation is expensive, and that's why a lot of these cases settle.
right.
But so I have learned the hard way. But I've also seen a lot more litigation between and among nonprofits, which I didn't used to see. I just don't think that used to happen quite as frequently. And so, as someone, I'm involved in a lot of nonprofits, both professionally and personally as a volunteer. So I really celebrate the work that they engage in. So I do try to work with my nonprofit clients as an expert, but also in a manner that could lower the temperature and get to a favorable resolution, possibly without going to trial. It always makes me a little sad to see nonprofits fighting with each other internally or all of these things. But it happens, and it seems we have become a more litigious society, I'm afraid.
Sure. And when you have different businesses trying to do good work like nonprofit, it is unfortunate for them to be fighting each other. It's
Exactly.
completely understandable. Does that sometimes is there a push for some of that to move to non-traditional litigation, like alternative dispute resolution, like arbitration and things like that?
I actually haven't seen that, no, which
Hmm.
is surprising. You'd think they would want to go to mediation. Some courts do require that as part of the litigation process. But most of the cases I see are in trial, and they've been filed in local courts, state courts, federal court, whatever it might be.
Sure, absolutely. You had talked about a lesson that you had learned vis-a-vis making sure that you charge a retainer and making sure that you get paid. uh, our podcast is primarily about those sorts of lessons. Do you have, before we wrap up, a story or two about, any expert witness engagements that turned out to be learning lessons for you, or any other insights that you've picked up along the way?
Sure. Well, I guess one lesson I picked up right away is that judges don't necessarily think that they need another lawyer in the case. You know, the legal arguments are to be made by the plaintiff's counsel and defendant's counsel. So I learned that my first task is to demonstrate to the judge and the parties that my perspective is a bit different. Tax laws are complicated, and so a general litigator is not going to understand the intricacies of the law, so that I provide that expertise. But also, as I mentioned, my expert work on behalf of nonprofits is similarly nuanced. Lawyers tend to not really understand the nonprofit governance issues, and
Hmm.
the interpersonal relationships that are so important in charitable operations. And with my extensive background with nonprofits as a lawyer and as a volunteer, I think I offer that perspective. But, I have to convince the judge or actually my client, to argue to the judge that I'm not just appearing as a lawyer, but as an expert witness. And one example of this is that I was hired relatively late in a case that was before a local court. And when I was reviewing the complaint, there was a statement by my client in the complaint that was just wrong. It was just legally, categorically incorrect.
Hmm.
So that's an experience that encourages me to, it's not good to jump in a case at the last minute. You have to really try to get involved early on. And in that case, luckily, the case did settle, and so it didn't become an issue. But when I saw that, I thought, oh no, if I'm on the stand and I have to defend that statement, or I have to talk to the client and get them to, amend the pleading or whatever it might be, that's going to be not a pleasant situation. So you have to be flexible in those situations and make the best of what might be an awkward situation, and really harmful to the client. Also, I've learned to have a thick skin, because even though I'm an expert and taken seriously, hopefully by the judge, but definitely by my client, opposing counsel is going to try to tear me apart limb by limb, because they don't want whatever I'm saying, which probably is going to go against their client, to be the final word.
Sure.
So you have to have a thick skin for the cross-examination part of this. But generally, lawyers are very respectful, so it's really not that much of an issue. But you have to be prepared for anything.
Absolutely. Sage advice. Miss Kuhn, thank you so much for joining me here today at the Roundtable.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners for joining me for another discussion at the Roundtable. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.